Assalamualaikum and thanks for tuning in. Okay, today I'd like to discuss about training effectiveness. There's a lot of discussion going around. There's a lot of inputs, feedback going around talking about training effectiveness, especially in the times where we are being forced to go into online training. So that there's most of this training effectiveness discussion has been around the topic of whether online or e-learning or remote learning, whether that type of training is as effective as it is in terms of face-to-face. But I would like to take a little bit of a different perspective, especially when we're talking about face-to-face training in comparison to online training, because again, at the end of the day, how sure are we all this while that our training delivery, even though face-to-face, is really effective? So let's explore and let's take a look at what is effectiveness specifically, and then we'll take a look into how training can be better in terms of effectiveness. All right. Now, effectiveness, there are basically two definitions of effectiveness. The first one, the most common one, is effectiveness in a sense that we are doing something that is in the most economical way, meaning that whatever we put in terms of our investment, in terms of our resource, whatever it is that we put in, input, produces an output that is of an acceptable ratio. Let's say, for example, you put in RM1 and you get something of the value for that RM1. We want that to be as the best or as equal as possible in terms of the value that we put in versus what we get out of it. So good input to good output ratio, most economical way. This is the first definition of effectiveness. The second definition of effectiveness is, all right, the second definition and also common way of looking at effectiveness is the capability to produce a desired result or produce a desired output to a satisfactory level or an expected degree that is suitable for the real world situation, because we know the real world situation is not necessarily ideal. So when we are faced with the situation, you get the best out of what you can get. So this is more common when we talk about training effectiveness. We are looking at application of what the participants have learned in the classroom into the real world itself. Now, that's where the key point is, or that's where my perspective about training effectiveness, I have a little bit of I would say a different interpretation of it, because as you have seen, and in the definition itself, the application is at the real world situation, meaning that you really cannot judge whether a training is effective or not by just looking at what happens in the classroom, or in the case of online learning, looking at what can be achieved in the online platform itself. So what we are looking at here is possibly not effectiveness per se, but when we talk about online being effective or not effective, probably we are looking at this word, efficacy. We are actually talking about efficacy, because efficacy, yes, the root word, or basically the word, comes from a similar usage in terms of effectiveness. Sometimes people use it interchangeably, but efficacy is more precise in talking about where the application is. You see, efficacy is the ability to perform a task to a satisfactory or expected degree, to produce the desired result, basically intended, in a confined environment or control setting. We hear this word a lot when we talk about medicine. People talk about the vaccine that's being tested right now. So testing of the vaccine is being done in a safe and controlled environment, which happens to be in the lab, so that they can get the ideal results based on the ideal parameters. So efficacy. So when we talk about measuring training, we are talking about, if you're just looking at the session itself, we are talking about efficacy. Effectiveness is when the participant go out and in the real life situation. Now, what gets measured gets done. What gets measured gets done. So in talking about effectiveness or efficacy of a training, we are talking about making sure that we measure results. Measure results in both situations, which is efficacy, the confined space of the training program itself, and also effectiveness in terms of when it is applied out in the real world. So there's two things that we need to take a look at. One is the measurement of results in a safe and controlled environment. We must be very clear in terms of what we want to measure and what we want to be able to see within that time frame. And also, when the real situation arises, or basically in the real world, when things happen and it is not ideal. For example, you go into a training and you talk about, for example, customer service. This is the situation, the customer walks in this way, this way, this way. But in the real world, in the real situation, there's also other variables that comes into play. Like say, for example, your health. Maybe on that particular day, you're just not up to your normal level of health, and then suddenly comes in a customer that is a little bit edgy, so you're not feeling good. The customer is feeling edgy, so it is not the most ideal situation to apply what you have learned. So at that point of time, what do you measure? How do you measure it? So this is where I think a lot of people tend to overlook when they talk about training effectiveness. And when we talk about online training, basically what we're talking about is we are imparting the lesson, the knowledge, the whatever skills we can help people to practice and polish with the confinement of the online platform, is basically to help them to identify what is the right strategy to do. So it is not really to say that online is not effective, because basically you still learn the same thing. Application happens in the real world. You get what I mean? So what is it that we can take a look at in the real world? What is it that we can measure? Okay, these are a few suggestions. Results. When we talk about results, first and foremost, usually people look at output because it is most easiest. It's tangible. So it's one of the most easiest thing to measure. How many things you produce, how many things you put out. Output. Number two, you take a look at the output versus the quality. Okay, you are able to produce 3 items. Is the items or are the items consistent in terms of quality? Does it achieve a certain level of acceptable quality? So that's the second thing you can measure. The third thing you can measure is time. How long does it take to produce the same item, same amount of item, volume, same amount of quality? So you're looking at time, you're measuring time. Next, you can measure, of course, cost. Is there a better way to do it so that you can save costs, so you can cut down your costs, and so on and so forth. These are all tangible things that you can really see and measure. Really, really tangible, very easy to measure. Also, you have to remember that some training programs, they cater towards the intangible items. Things like customer service. Customer service, what I mentioned here is not the program itself, but what I'm talking about here is how people interact with the customer. Because people, or basically the customer comes in to buy a product. The service that comes with the product also affects the customer's decision, possibly also affects the customer's experience. So who gives this service? The service can be in a form of from the moment the customer walks into the shop, for example. Could be how the people interacting with the customer, and so on and so forth. So these are things that's a little bit intangible, we cannot really measure. Next is work climate. Sure, dealing with customer, that's one element, but there is also the element of working within the organization itself, how you interact with your colleagues. Are you happy? Is that feeling of being in the company, the positive feeling, it translates into work. So work climate is also something that we can measure, or basically we should measure in terms of talking about the results. And the last component, my suggestion is also to take a look at and measure work habits, because some work habits causes certain effect. Okay, so these are the things that we can consider when we measure something as in in this context, we are talking about training effectiveness. So in the real world, when the participants completed the training, you would want to take a look at these elements. So coming back to what I mentioned earlier, effectiveness and efficacy is about measuring the results whether in a controlled environment or in the real world. When you talk about a training must be effective, you're talking about the results of applying that training, which is in the real world. If you're talking about training must be effective in terms of you want to see the reaction, participants are happy, they don't complain, that is a different thing. You're measuring a different thing. So this is why the metric model is very important, and I think it's one of the most basic thing that people need to understand, because when we measure in the feedback form, that is measuring level 1 reaction, whether the participants like it, whether the training material was relevant, whether the activity was fun. So all of this that we are measuring, we are just measuring the reaction, not even looking at the content, the lesson learned and application. So that's the first level. The second level, we are talking about learning. So what has been imparted in the training, we want to make sure that it is being processed and absorbed by the participant. At least by the end of the program, they remember. Okay. Now, next, of course, what we want to measure is the possibility of a change in their behavior, whether they have applied their learning. They can learn, they can score like 100 marks, okay, full mark, they can score. But when they go back to the workplace, their work habits just now, when you go back to the workplace, the working environment does not help. So these are the things that we want to ensure happens, okay? And this is outside of the classroom, okay? The trainer has already gone home back. He's not, unless you're talking about in-house trainers. But if you're talking about external trainers, the trainers are not there anymore. So it is all up to the participant. And what gets measured gets done. What gets monitored gets done. If the participants are not monitored in terms of how they implement what they have learned, most likely you won't see any behavior changes. And those behavior changes should be the right behavior that impacts the results. The right behavior that brings the right results. If you're talking about better time, you're talking about better quality, consistency in quality, you're talking about the amount of volume of output, you're talking about cost. All of this must relate to the right behavior. So in essence, what I'm talking about here is when we discuss about training effectiveness, we have to take a look at what is it at the end of the day that we are looking at, what are the indicators that we want to measure. Because if we are measuring based on the feedback form, and we say that a training is not effective, for example, online training is not effective because participants don't like it, they are not engaged, they don't feel there's interaction, that is basically only level 1. You're talking about level 1. Can they learn? If they pay attention, if they focus, if the right strategies has been used, probably learning can happen. But the question is, do you measure the learning level 2? And so on and so forth. Are you training the right behavior? Are you training the right items? Are you talking about the right objectives are being set so that it reflects to the results? So these are other elements, other components, other things that needs to be looked at, not just talking about the platform itself. So in essence, coming back, what happens in the safe and controlled environment of the classroom or online learning in the platform is just the ability to measure or to say that the training is effective at level 1 and 2. Okay. Now, if you want to see real world application, you are talking about level 3 and level 4, and this requires a whole different strategy of measurement. Okay, so this is where management must participate or basically get involved so that the design of the program fits the right needs, and the measurement is you're measuring the right things lah, basically. All right, so that's a little bit of my sharing in terms of when we talk about training effectiveness. Okay, training effectiveness is not just about the activities in the classroom. It's not just whether the participant like it, whether it's engaging or not, whether learning happens. That is training efficacy. Okay, we are talking about training effectiveness in terms of real world application. Therefore, a measurement of level 3 and level 4. This one doesn't really depend too much on the strategy or the platform. It can be face to face, it can be online, as long as the goal is reached and the results is very clear and you can measure it after the training. So that's my sharing for today. Thanks for tuning in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Stay safe.